Swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. You scared and place, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello, minions. Welcome back to Professor Awesome and the Minions of Doom. It has been a couple of weeks. Those of you who follow me on social media know it's because I have a giant gaping sewage hole in my kitchen, which has made life difficult. The reason I'm telling you about this is I've had two complaints lately about the netcast. One is, why don't you talk more about yourself? So you get to hear that I have a giant gaping sewage hole in my kitchen, which we're repairing. Is taking a great deal of my time. The other complaint is, why don't you get yourself a radio mic? And my answer to that is, great. After I'm done paying for a giant gaping sewage hole in my floor, maybe I'll get around to buying a radio mic. But until that time, you get to deal with me with my terrible mic situation that I have here. But frankly, if anyone is listening to Professor Awesome because they are interested in the great sound quality and the wonderful video and audio editing done by our video and audio engineer, that is me, they are watching and listening to the wrong cast. So those of you who are watching on the netcast today, you already can see front and center my guest today, and I have today Alexis Fajardo. He is the cartoonist and creator of the Kid Beowulf series, and I've got several of the Kid Beowulf books here, which, yeah, and there's another one which I have not here. Actually, I haven't seen that one yet, and another version of it. Yes, and he's also the senior editor at Charles Schultz, a senior editor, a senior editor.
I'm the senior editor.
The senior editor at Charles Schultz Studios. So.
I had to kill a lot of people for that title.
It does. Is there a long line of people who like? What would you say in terms of sheer number of people who had to be killed for that?
I can't disclose that, actually.
Right,
They're in a gaping hole in our studio, and we'll never be seen from again.
Right. Well, I mean, frankly, I probably should keep the gaping sewage hole open in my house so that I can throw minions of doom who displease me down in the hole.
Yeah.
But, I first started talking about the Kid Beowulf series, I don't know how many years ago, many years ago.
Probably 10 years ago, I think like in 2007.
Yeah, that sounds about right. But the reason that I'm having Lex on today is because at the end of this month, February 28th, and presumably the audio version of this, for those of you who listen to the podcast, should be available by then. He's re-releasing Kid Beowulf and the Song of Roland, which he's holding up in this beautiful red cover here. Re-releasing it in the mastered edition in full colors. Look at that. See, I have the classic version. Those of you who are looking, which is black and white, but the new one is in full color, Beowulf and the Song of Roland. So anyway, welcome, Lex.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so let's go back to the very beginning. So you started with, well, first of all, what is the Kid Beowulf series?
Sure. So it is a graphic novel series. I've been working on it for quite a long time. I think 17 years creatively, maybe 10 years where it's been in a professional guise, like published. And the first edition that you were holding up before, actually the first book in the series, The Bloodbound Oath, came out in 2008. And I think you were nice enough to review it, and even your lovely daughter gave it a blurb. So that was a black and white edition, and it was with a small boutique publisher in Portland, Bowler Hat Comics. And couple years after that, I did the black and white version of Kid Beowulf and the Song of Roland. And the conceit of Kid Beowulf is basically, it's a riff on Beowulf. It takes arch enemies Beowulf and Grendel, and it turns them into 12-year-old twin brothers, which could be sacrilegious for some listening, some of your ardent listeners. But I promise them it all makes sense in the end. I go back a couple generations. I explain the relationship, how they became brothers, that the sea hag, who I've named Gertrude, is their mother, and the great dragon that Beowulf slays at the end of the original epic is their grandfather, and King Hrothgar is in there, and it's all basically a family feud that by the end of the story we have these twins who then go off into the other parts of Europe and Asia, and they meet other epic heroes, and they get into other adventures, and along the way they discover their true destiny, which is to fight each other. So it all leads back to the original Beowulf, and it's all about whether or not they'll embrace that destiny or fight against it. And if you know Beowulf, you know how it ends. So that's kind of the basic conceit, and it's filled with action and humor and fantasy. I have a very cartoony style. I think if you're familiar with comics like Bone or Amulet, or like things like Tolkien, or just the fantasy genre, that kind of hits those notes. And the second book, The Song of Roland, is all about the French epic.
Okay. And how many books do you have at the moment?
There are 3 books, 3 full-length graphic novels, which are all about 200 pages each. And I've also done a couple of short stories that kind of tease out different characters who I didn't have time enough to really play with in the longer story. So, for instance, I have one here. One is called Shield and the Dragon, and that sort of plays up the first encounter of Shield, who is Beowulf's great-grandfather, and how he first meets the dragon. And this is several generations before Beowulf is brought into the mix, and it's all about their tussle. So one loses an eye, one loses a hand, sort of playing with those mythic elements. And then another short story that I just came out with actually is called The Paladin's Tale. And I do them under this subtitle, Kid Beowulf Eddas. So kind of playing around with the expanded universe. And the Edda's Tale basically follows some of these guys right here who are Charlemagne's peers, the Paladins. And it's a story that I didn't have time to touch on in the original graphic novel, but it's basically a breakout story. These guys are thrown into prison by Ganelon, who has become the evil Lord Steward of France. And each of these guys contrives to bust out of their separate prisons in their own manner. One uses his brain, one uses his brawn, one uses his wits. And that was a really fun story to do, and it came out just last month. So when I have the time, I like to do these short stories, and then it sort of gets me primed to do the next book in the series.
And you've also got, like, in addition to that, you've got, I thought I had it here, and I just realized I took it home to frame it, because I have a room in my house that my daughter dubbed Nerd Haven, which is full of all the nerdiest things, and I had a poster, a rad or read poster.
Yes.
Promoting literacy posters, Kid Beowulf. But you also have an app with a kind of Candy Crush style game called. I can't believe I can't remember the name of the game, because now I have played it through so many times. Look at the Lincolnberries. Yes, I played it so many times that now I'm always just trying to, on every, and there's I think 100 levels.
Yes.
There's a lot of levels. Every one I'm trying to sort of beat my score a little bit more on that level. So I've definitely played it through.
That's good to hear.
I did not expect to be addicted to that game, but I at one point literally I had to uninstall it because it was preventing me from getting work done. And was killing my battery. You know, you can only play that game for so many hours before your battery goes dead. So. Oh,
good. It's good to know. I'm glad you enjoyed it. That's great. That was a little lark, an experiment. This fellow, he was a game designer out in Greece, and he had read my stuff online, and he wanted to just work with an IP. So we sat together and over email and the like, and put together a a short game that's based on Candy Crush, so it has that kind of matching element. But as you go through the story, you unlock, or as you go through the game, you unlock a story which is all about Beowulf looking for his favorite thing, which are lingonberries. And that's another short story that takes place right after the end of book one, and it kind of reveals this relationship Beowulf has with these two heathobards, Emer and Ermlof, who are also kind of chasing them through the story. So we get a little background information on them. So yeah, there's a little bit of a Kid Beowulf. I hesitate to say empire, but it's a little village of creative works and short stories and apps and I have to tell you, the rad poster. So for those who are wondering what that is, I did a poster that has all my characters and they're reading a book, and it says, it's a riff on those library posters that say read, but it says read in Old English, and you were kind enough to help me, figure out what that would actually look like, and I take them to my signings in schools and libraries, and I tell the kids this, this is read in Old English, and they totally dig it, and so I love that. I'm getting them into the nerd culture of scholarly pursuits.
That's ultimately cruel of you.
That's right.
So you started, I guess, 17 years ago or so. You started creatively thinking about this. What, if you can sort of cast back when this was just a glimmer of an idea?
Right.
Where did it come from? This is an idea.
I think it came from my love of Asterix. When I grew up, I read the French comic book Asterix, and I remember distinctly getting the very first book that I was given by a friend of the family was Asterix the Legionary, and I read that thing cover to cover several times through that in that one weekend, and I just always wanted to write and draw like René Goscinny and Albert Uderzo, who were the creators. Collected all the books, and then of course, my love for cartooning expanded from there. But that was a first love, and when I started this journey of being a professional cartoonist, a friend of mine was putting together a small little mini comic of adventures, and he wanted it to be fantasy based, and he knew that I always loved things like Asterix, but at the same time I was a classics nerd, and he said, just come up with something for fun. And at the time I happened to be rereading Beowulf, because that's what nerds like us do, and it was the Burton Raffel translation, which is still one of my favorites, and the notion of Beowulf as a kid just kind of popped into my head, and that just seemed kind of funny to me, because he's just this massive hulking warrior, and his confrontation with Grendel is so vicious. But that idea stuck, and it started as a small mini comic. I did maybe 10 pages. A friend of mine was writing it with me, and it was very gaggy. It was very sort of Asterix inspired, and I was just kind of learning the craft, because my cartooning at that point was very rough, and I was trying to figure out, even what the story was, because at that point it was just a riff on stupid gags like Danes and Danish donuts and things like that, and arm ripping, and I kind of just shelved it for a while and pursued other cartooning things. I wanted to be a syndicated cartoonist for a while, but the story kept nagging at me, and I brought it out of its hibernation and sat down again and kind of rethink it, and I did just a complete overhaul of the series. But the big thing that always sort of maintained was the fact that Beowulf and Grendel were going to be twin brothers, which is the big twist and the big reveal. But sort of working with that premise, I worked backwards and kind of to seed a story. But some of the elements, like the idea that there were twins and the idea that they would travel across Europe and Asia, because I love epic poetry and I love these legends and these stories, that was always set from the beginning. And ideas of who they would meet and who they would encounter and the kinds of adventures, those were always there. But through the course of 17 odd years, it's grown, and obviously my storytelling, my artwork has gotten a lot better, and I feel I'm kind of at a space where I'm excited to see where it'll go, and it has a new life as a colored version, and I'm basically reintroducing it to folks who'd never heard of it before.
Now, so way back when you came at this, generally as a nerd, but specifically as a cartooning nerd, right?
Yes.
Now, in the many years that this has come on, your work has been used by university professors. You have, and you started attending to showcase your work, like really sort of medieval academic conferences, like you presented I'd say 3 years ago at the Medieval Congress, International Medieval Congress. You've sort of at some point sort of wandered also into the academic world, and before we were before the sort of the talk before, the pre-interview talk, I noticed how much, in talking to you now, I think I talked to you on the phone for the first time like 10 years ago, how much just sort of very, what we think about as very academic words or very obscure terms just sort of roll off your tongue without thinking about it. You don't ever think, it doesn't strike me that you think about things like Edda. Maybe the average person doesn't know what the term Edda means.
Not the smartest marketing tool, I'll tell you that much.
But of course, every medievalist goes, "Oh yes, that makes perfect sense. Isn't that clever, right?"
Right.
I don't know how you would. How does this sort of like? How far have you gotten into this sort of the academic side of this? I mean, obviously your day job is very successful cartoonist, fulfilling, right there at the top of the profession with others. How? So that's not your main thrust, but where's your academic sort of work, I guess, gone to?
I think a lot of that love for the scholarly pursuit of it, and the geeking out and the nerding out about, like, our bookshelves are basically the same. I'm looking behind you. I'm saying, "Oh, yeah, I got
Right.
that book and that book." My father's a professor. He's a professor of Golden Age Spanish poetry with an emphasis on Cervantes. So
you were doomed from the cradle, is what you're saying. Yeah,
exactly.
This is a sad story.
And the cartooning part is the thing I've loved since I was a kid, but I'm self-taught. So for me, it was always from an academic point of view. I studied classics in college, and I drew on the side. So, which is why I think it's taken so long for me for my artistic side to kind of gel. I mean, I think the ideas were there, but the art had to catch up with it. And you're right. Like using a phrase like Edda is probably, my. If I had a marketing manager, they'd be like, rapping me on the head, like, nobody knows what an Edda is. What does that mean? But I like doing that because I think it just makes the world a little richer. And in fact, the references I'm making in the book are fairly obscure, and it's not intentional. It's just because as I do the research, I keep finding all these really fascinating points of interest. I remember actually when I was at the Kalamazoo Congress a couple years ago, and a fellow, and this always happens whenever I go to, especially academic conferences, because people will walk by the table and they'll snicker at first at the notion of Kid Beowulf, but they'll kind of keep their distance because they they're rightly skeptical, and then I kind of call them over and they'll, as I talk to them about what I'm doing and the influences, and they'll start to get intrigued. And one fellow was looking at the Song of Roland, and he said, "Oh my gosh, you put Ogier the Dane in here?" And the fact that he even knew who Ogier was great to me because he's one of my favorite characters. But he's an obscure Carolingian hero that nobody knows who that guy is. But or Bradamant or Renault or all these these old characters that are sort of lost to the mists and dusts of time. So the idea that I could bring them into this and somebody who knows them can appreciate that, and then some 12-year-old kid who's never seen them before can be inspired by them too. That's a great kind of mix, and that's thrilling for me as a creator.
Yeah, and I think they live in this space where, like, there's a certain kind of, especially cartoon, where there are gags that are intended for the adults that the kids aren't going to get. I think I think often of like the old Popeye cartoons, where what Popeye would say sort of regularly was for everybody, and then he would mutter something which was adult and sometimes very adult under his breath.
Yeah.
But that's not the way. I feel like that's not really what's happening here. I feel like I remember my daughter and I looked. It says she was in the 7th grade when she read your book. When she read your book, she followed it as an adventure story, really, as a kind of fantasy story.
Right.
And of course, when I'm reading it, I mean, the gags I think are on the level that a 10-year-old can understand, presumably. But there are all these other kind of obscure academic and literary references in it. So rather than being kind of, I guess, wink and a nod sort of thing, there's a sense that you've taken the DNA of this whole medieval literary world from these romances, these eddas, these sagas, epics, and you sort of taken all those bits and pieces and constructed them into something. And it seems like it's almost inevitable that it's going to have strong adult appeal, even if you had intended it. Even if you had intended it from the beginning to, this is just for kids. But that really isn't what you intended, right? I mean, what were you thinking in terms of audience?
It was really, this is going to sound selfish, but it was really for me and like-minded people. Like, like Tina Fey, I first was introduced to Wagner through Bugs Bunny, and I loved, as I said before, myths and legends, but my style is very cartoony. Again, that Asterix component and the Looney Tunes, and then Jeff Smith's Bone was a really big inspiration. So I think the aesthetic sort of grew out organically from my own likes and desires to sort of to create something that was unique but also familiar. And that's the other thing is like I want to make Beowulf and the Song of Roland and Gilgamesh and the Odyssey accessible to kids. So when they hopefully they'll be inspired actually to see what the real Beowulf is all about. And so in the beginning of each book, I do a prologue that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of each of these epics. So at least if they've never read Beowulf, if they've never read the Song of Roland, they have a good footing. At least they know what the parameters of the original story are. And then I go hog wild with my own version of it. But by the time they close that book, I'm hoping that there's enough in there that maybe they'll want to reread it, and more importantly, maybe they'll want to just pick up that Burton Raffel or Seamus Heaney version of Beowulf and see what it's all about. Because these stories they're great and they're just pure entertainment. So I really appreciate those people like you who can dig into the actual Old English of it, which I've never been able to do, and glean out all the beautiful references and at the same time I really love those versions that are less what's the right word that are just a little more playful. Mm-hmm.
So at the beginning of you talked about the prologues, and I've wanted to ask you this for a while. The prologues are all poetic.
Yeah. Which
are only a few pages, and then the rest of it is prose in image. Do you regret starting? by now, when you're writing a prologue, do you think, why did I ever start this as poetic, or is that something you enjoy?
I think it's me trying to channel that Homer in whatever guise I can. And it's not iambic pentameter at all, but it does rhyme. And but you're right, like trying to come up with a rhyme scheme every now and then, to rhyme with something like Astyanax is not easy, or whatever it might be. So we'll see though if that tradition of the prologue will continue in like the second trilogy. I just started to write book 4, and it's the story about Romulus and Remus, and I'm wondering whether or not since that's a little bit more I think, well known. If it needs a full-on prologue, or if I can do a couple of pages that tell the original story. Things like Roland and El Cid definitely need the prologue because I think they're a little more obscure. But also the prologue is a great hook for the more academic people who might be interested. Teachers, for instance, I think it gives them a good foundation to sort of, share the epic with their students.
Yeah. Now you're speaking of Remus, Romulus and Remus. So you've started doing for the last few years. You started doing a lot of events at schools and literacy promotion and this kind of thing. And so maybe even though you weren't originally thinking I'm going to do a thing for kids or this is an educational venture. It's in some ways it's also turned into that.
Right.
So, and one thing we started talking about, and I just want to hear you tell a little bit more about it, is some of these have really, particularly violence, very kind of adult ideas in it. And how are you dealing with that? What are you? Tell me a little about your struggles in that and what you're doing as you're moving forward with the next trilogy.
Right. No, it's a really good question because so if someone were to look at the prologues, they're drawn in a different style. They're a little more classic, illustrative kind of style. I draw them, but it's more representational. So the scene where Beowulf is ripping off Grendel's arm, I show that, and there's a scene in Roland where Roland cuts off somebody's hand, and I show that, and then as El Cid also has some intense scenes. I have them painted in sort of like a duotone watercolor, so it the intent there is the prologue maybe feels like a little bit like a Ridley Scott movie, if I can even be so bold. But again, the interior, the rest of that story is all cartoony. So whatever violence that I'm showing, I think just because of the style, it's tamped down a little bit. It's not as kooky as something like Wile E. Coyote. There are swords, people are getting slashed. With these new color editions, I actually have to be conscious of, when somebody gets hit, is it blood or is it spittle, or because I'm coloring this now, so there's a visual, more of a impact visual component. But it is tricky to figure out exactly where the line is, especially now with these new color editions that the publisher is focusing towards the kids market a little bit more. So, for instance, the Song of Roland, I'm sure you're familiar with this and your listeners too. It's about the struggle between the Christian Franks and the Muslim Saracens, which that's still something, I hate to say it, sadly enough, is still happening in this day and age. And how do we, deal with that? And at the time when the Song of Roland was written, it was even used to incite the Crusades. So there's some heavy material there. And when I was writing the book, or originally I wrote it back in I think 2008, 2009, post 9/11. We were at war with Iraq. I don't know if you remember the phrase "freedom fries," but people's perception of the world was very different, and I really took umbrage towards how people perceived France. And so when I was writing the book in particular, I wanted it to sort of be a sort of a love letter to France and all the great things that the French have done, and wrap it in the guise of the epic poem. But I also didn't want it to be jingoistic, so I didn't want the Saracens and the Muslims to come off as sort of the crazy pagans that they're shown in the original epic. So that was sort of something I played with. I don't know if I was successful. I'd like to think I was able to walk that line pretty well, but I am curious to see how that's going to be interpreted with this new color edition. So we'll see. And then, so that's sort of a kind of an adult theme on a narrative level. And then for this next book I'm working on, it's all about Romulus and Remus and the foundation of Rome, and that's the fratricide. And how do I actually work that in. I'm trying to figure out the best way to tell that story, because for me, ultimately, I want to be true to the epics, and I don't want to tell a story that didn't happen. And so at the core, there has to be that fidelity to the original epic. As I said, the whole thrust of it is that Beowulf and Grendel are going to learn that they have to confront each other, and that's pretty grim. So,
and since your conceit is you've reconceived them as brothers, it's another fratricide,
right?
This Remus and Romulus. I was about to say prefiguring them, but postfiguring them,
right.
I guess, in a way. So,
yeah,
since time is sort of messed up in this,
and time
narrative,
is certainly
right?
elastic in this universe. But the whole notion of that I wanted to play with Romulus and Remus was specifically because it was a fratricide, and that it would echo, Beowulf and Grendel would witness that, and as they go further into their journey, that would be something that they would remember, and so I don't know if I have a good answer for you, other than that I'm struggling with it and trying to figure out how to tell these stories as best I can for the audiences I'm telling them for.
Yeah, and I want to, like, if someone has not seen any of these, any of Lex's books, we've been talking about the kind of adult themes in them, but just to be clear, like, I was perfectly comfortable letting my daughter, when she was in 7th grade, and my son when he was in elementary school, I can't remember how old he was when he wanted to look at one. I was perfectly comfortable letting them look at it. So these are not. If someone's afraid they're looking at the graphic novel version of Game of Thrones,
right.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
It's not like that.
I feel like I can, since we're sort of in an academic, conversation, I can kind of get into the back matter, and your readers won't, or your listeners won't be bored by it. But yeah, actually, a lot of my readers, some of my most fervent readers, are 8 and 9-year-olds, and I have some that have read and reread the Song of Roland a dozen times, and they'll ask me all about these connections between the characters, and that's really fun because it is resonating with them, even though they've never read the Song of Roland in any other guise but my own. So that's exciting, and it's always fun to introduce all these epics to school kids when I go and share them my work.
Now you're not the first person to sort of take up doing a kind of graphic representation of Beowulf. And there have been a lot which are beloved by academics, like Gareth Hines,
Sure.
very beautiful version. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about DC Comics. I want to talk about DC Comics,
Okay.
Beowulf Dragon Slayer series.
Have you read the entire thing?
No, I have read 6 books, I think.
Wow, it's more. That's 5.
Because I couldn't.
So.
Those were the most I could get. Oh well. Well, tell me about your experience with Beowulf Dragon Slayer, the DC Comics version. Do I have them here? I don't think they're here.
I've only ever seen them online when I was doing research for my own stuff. I never really read them. I know that they pretty good. They go pretty far afield. I think doesn't he at one point fight the devil or something like that, or they're all kind of all over the place, right?
He does, but what really happens is Dracula kills Satan with a stalagmite. So as happens both theologically
Right.
and in Bram Stoker's work.
Yeah.
It actually has my favorite single panel of any comic. The series does, not the first one. My favorite single panel of any comic book.
Really?
Series. Yes, it is so wonderful.
Can you describe it?
I will.
Okay.
I will describe it. You have no choice but to hear me describe my favorite panel. What has happened in this book is aliens have come and taken Beowulf, and they've decided that I've forgotten why, they're taking all these great heroes from history, and they have them in suspended animation in their spaceship for alien reasons that I'm sure were made clear in the book, but I've forgotten. And at some point, Beowulf manages to break out, and he has with him 2 people. One is Nanzi, who's this Amazon princess warrior type, who is, I guess, the love interest as much as there's a love interest in it. It's mostly just them beating people up together. And Ulysses, or Odysseus for those who know him under the other name. And they take control of this, or I think they bust up the control panel or something. They beat up the aliens, and the spaceship begins to crash. And there's an active volcano on Atlantis.
Holy smokes!
And they leap out of the active volcano, but the alien spacecraft going into the active volcano causes the volcano to explode and destroy the entire, destroy Atlantis. And so, and interestingly enough, Ulysses says, "Oh, by the way, you can find a boat of mine or raft that I left hidden in such and such a place to flee the island." How he got there, why he would have left it there is a great, it's a great mystery. But what I love about this panel is it is the image of Beowulf, an Amazon princess, and Ulysses leaping out of a crashing spacecraft onto an active volcano, and they're fine. They can leap out of it, so because that's how physics works.
Yeah.
That one panel encapsulates to me all the craziness, every bit of Dracula coming in and killing Satan and all those sorts of sort of things. But actually, this gets to.
I was going to say that description doesn't make me feel as bad to have thrown a theme park in the second book so I feel like we're on the same page here. It's great.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I was wondering, like, at what point do you feel like, because clearly the DC Comics writers maybe a little bit in the first book, but once you get past the first book, they have zero qualms about leaving the source material at all. At what point do you start to feel as an artist the pull back to the source material? When do you feel like I can't go that far anymore?
It's a great question. I think that the early books, I was trying to find the right tone to set. And again, I was trying to shed a lot of the Asterix influence, because Asterix is very punny. It's even more cartoony than mine. I think somebody described my style as cartoony but proportional, which I thought was interesting. And Asterix is just sort of squash and stretch. So it can get a little crazier. So I think early on, I was just trying to figure out what my style was going to be, both visually and then narratively. And then, and so there are some elements in the second book that are a little, I think, they go a little far afield, like the idea that there is this theme park. And originally in the first drafts, it was a riff on Euro Disney. And I was able to massage it to make it, I think, work for the story. It's sort of, Roland's ego writ large that he has to kind of destroy to save his people. But that theme park is kind of a reminder. Okay, that's a little too far. Even though the kids love it, whenever they read Roland, oftentimes they tell me, oh, that's their favorite because it's high adventure and it's a little kooky and it's crazy. But for my own aesthetic, I think I really kind of toned it back a little in book 3 when they went to Spain. I kind of tried to keep it a little within some better parameters. Although in terms of princesses, long lost princesses, I do throw Boudica in there. So Beowulf and Boudica are a future love connection. And then as I craft number 4, Romulus and Remus, I'm doing as best I can to do the hard research and place it in a good timeline that makes sense. So I think moving forward, I've kind of figured out how far I can go, and kind of the wackiness of Roland, you probably won't see too much moving forward. So,
so when you go to these events, what is it? We've several times alluded to these events that you do at schools, and I forget sometimes not everyone knows what you're doing.
Right.
So tell us about these events and what you do.
every now and then I'll be invited to come to a school or a library to share my work because the books thankfully have made it into the school libraries and the kids are kind of familiar with Kid Beowulf or just graphic novels in general. Graphic novels have actually, the last 4 or 5 years, have become a huge boon to schools because kids like to read them and teachers want kids to read. And now and whether it's comics or graphic novels or full-length books, as long as the kids are reading, I think the teachers are excited. So I get invited to these schools and libraries, and usually they're big assemblies, like maybe 200, 300 kids.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it's a big crowd, and they're all about 8 years and up. And I just take them through, kind of a history, mythology, how to draw a lecture of what Kid Beowulf is, where it comes from. I tell them all about Beowulf. Many of them have never heard of it before, so I do like a Cliff Notes version of what the original is, and then how I've adapted it into my cartoony version. I show them how I draw the comic, all the research that goes into it, the writing of it, what the drawn pages look like. It's about a 50-minute presentation. There's Q&A. The kids are it's always fun to share my work with them, and hopefully by the end of it, if they're not inspired to read my stuff, at least they walk away with some inkling of what Beowulf is. So I feel like I've accomplished something.
Have you had anyone produce any Kid Beowulf fan fiction?
Oh yeah,
these kids,
yeah.
or?
I wonder. Actually, let's see. 1 second. I'm just reaching here. So I have
for the.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So these are some. This is some fan art that a student or a young fan sent me. This is Nagling, who Beowulf's sword, and in my version, Nagling he nags Beowulf a lot, so he's a talking sword. And then here's just one of Beowulf. It's actually pretty good.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah. So
it's got he's got the proportions, right? Cartoony but proportionate.
Right.
And the one below is really good.
That's right. So I got to be careful because these kids are gonna, draw me out of a job if I'm not too careful.
Right. Well, you got to just tell them, listen, what you did is great, but it's not canon, and if you claim it is, I'm going to sue you.
Right.
That you have to take that route to put them in their place.
Yeah.
With all this, and you've got a school event or a library event coming up here shortly. Or
yes.
A book fair.
So I'm in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and they're doing this month-long comic art festival. Every weekend, they've invited cartoonists and authors to come and speak at school. So I'll be doing a couple of those at the end of this week, and I'm looking forward to it. It should be fun.
Okay, so if you're listening to this on the podcast, you probably aren't going to have a chance to see that.
No.
But if you're watching on the netcast, this will probably be up by the 23rd.
Yeah, but I am actually
so
hoping to create a portable version of my presentations, so people who are not in the Bay Area and if they have Kid Beowulf in their class and they want to introduce it to their students can throw these up on YouTube and it'll be my presentation and the how to draw segments and all of that for teachers and librarians. So I'm hoping to make that a resource, and that'll be on my website hopefully in the next month or two.
Now, obviously, how to. I mean, given the position that you have, you know what it takes. If you just want to make something marketable, if I said you have to make a marketable, you have to make a marketable comic, and I don't care what it's on as long as it sells. You have a sense of how to do that. You know how to find a market niche and all that kind of stuff. Is there a place that you've resisted going that you know would get a lot more attention for the series, but you think, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to omit this, or I'm not going to go to that place?
Well, I don't know. I think if I were really smart, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, which is taking all these obscure epics and doing a twist on them. But I think when it comes down to the long hours you're going to spend at a drawing board, it better be for something you love. My stuff. I will be the first to admit my stuff is super rich and super quirky, and I'm just happy that the long struggle to find a publisher who believes in it is I have that, because I think the source material itself is good enough to get out there, whether or not I end up doing with it. I wish I actually was a little better at the marketing end, because I think I probably wouldn't end up doing the kind of books I'm doing, but I probably wouldn't be as happy either. As you said, my day job, I work at the Schultz studio, so we're the licensing component of the Peanuts legacy, Charlie Brown, Snoopy. Even though Schultz has passed away, people still love those characters. And that's sort of one of the things we have to do every day is make sure that whoever's using those images uses Snoopy and Charlie Brown the way Mr. Schultz would have wanted that. And you wouldn't believe the number of requests we get of, like, are there more poses of Charlie Brown smiling or Snoopy prancing? And it's like, well, he didn't draw that many because being happy isn't funny. So, a lot of times people want the big grinning image of Charlie Brown, and we kind of point him to the one that's a little more authentic, where he's sad and he didn't kick the football. So it's something we're battling with all the time, and I know for my own stuff, there's, there'd be that desire to maybe go that route, but it's I think I get enough of that at my day job. So.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to. I mean, following your stuff on social media, sometime. I don't want to go too far afield with this, but sometime I'd love to get you on to talk about Peanuts. And as someone who works with it all the time, you have thought through some things in a very much deeper level, I think, than most people have. And I'm always fascinated by your reading of something. And I know that your readings are smart and right, because I usually have the same reading. So,
right.
but yours is well considered, whereas mine is a kind of gut instinct. I think it's this, and then you'll write something which will demonstrate with actual evidence rather than just popping off as I will about it. But
you knew it in your gut. So I mean, that's even.
I knew it in my gut.
Yeah.
Hey, the truth is, I read when I was a kid and would go to the library. The only comic books that I read, I read nerdy books, and then sort of pre-academic books, I guess I would say, and I read Peanuts too. I've read so many Peanuts. And I would get, they'd be remarketed in a different a book with a slightly different set of strips in it, and I'd be so frustrated when I would get to one like, oh, I've read this in this other larger omnibus version, or there's overlap in this one, and also I'm actually taking some of my material. I keep leaving when I take PowerPoint presentations to class, I used to leave my USB drive there, and I kept losing these USB drives, which was fine. The only thing on them was PowerPoints, but I had to keep replacing the USB drives. This is very obnoxious. And so finally, I got this.
Oh, very nice.
Which those of you who are on the podcast don't see. It's a little Charlie Brown USB drive. And I'm sorry, he is smiling.
See, you know what I'm talking about.
Right. So when in the several times I have accidentally left it again in the computer, everyone goes, "Oh, I know who that belongs to," and it returns.
Nice.
Because there are not that many of them. But before we go, I want to give you one more chance to plug what's upcoming.
Sure.
Tell everybody where they can get it and etc.
Yeah. So this is a book we've been talking about. It's Kid Beowulf, The Song of Roland, and it comes out next Tuesday It is the second adventure in the Kid Beowulf mythos. It's available wherever fine books are sold, or online if you like Amazon or all that stuff. And I've been doing a lot of fun promotional materials. If you're on Instagram, you could follow me at LexKidB. That's the same handle I have on Twitter. I've been doing this thing called 28 Days of Roland. So they're on the Instagram and also on my Facebook, Kid Beowulf. They're kind of like a behind-the-scenes look. So I'll post pencils or finished inks or just nerdy stuff about the research I've done. Today I did a post all about Ogier's blade Cortana and where that came from and how it's similar to Charlemagne's sword Joyeux and Durandal, which was Roland's blade. So stuff I think maybe hopefully your listeners would appreciate. But no, I thank you for having me and chatting up the book.
All right, thanks for being on. This has been Alexis Fajardo. He's the cartoonist and creator of the Kid Beowulf series. Our music, for those of you who listen to the podcast, the music at the top of the podcast is by Wreck the System. And until next time, minions,